It's a question people ask sometimes. Did some law somewhere tell farmers they had to grow hemp? It's not as simple as a yes or no. The story of hemp in America is long and twisting. It involves essential needs, economic shifts, a big war, and a lot of confusion. Let's just talk about it, chapter by chapter, and see what really happened. Hemp has been around forever. People used it for thousands of years. It's one of the oldest plants cultivated by humans. We used it for everything from ropes to cloth to paper. So when European settlers came to what would become America, they brought hemp seeds with them. They knew how important it was. Picture this, it's the 1600s, the early colonies. Life is tough. You need everything. You need food, sure, but you also need stuff to build with and clothes to wear. And more than anything, if you're a colony dependent on ship sea for trade, for defense, for just getting new people here, you need rope and sails. A lot of rope, a lot of sails, and the best plant for that was hemp. England, the mother country, really wanted the colonies to grow hemp. Why? Because England had to buy a lot of its hemp from other countries, mainly Russia. That made England vulnerable. If Russia decided to stop selling, or if there was a war, England's navy and merchant fleet would be in trouble. They wanted their own supply from their own colonies. It just made good sense from an empire perspective. So the colony started growing it. Virginia was one of the first. In 1619, the Virginia Company, which ran the colony, passed a law. This law wasn't exactly saying every farmer must grow hemp or go to jail. It was more about encouraging it. It directed planters to grow English flax and hemp. They knew it was vital. They were saying, look, this is really important for us. Get on it. Other colonies followed suit. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maryland, they all had laws or proclamations trying to get farmers to grow hemp. Sometimes these laws offered incentives. They might say, we'll pay you for your hemp, or you can use hemp to pay your taxes. That's a pretty strong push, right? If you can pay your taxes with a crop, you're probably going to think about growing it. But even with these pushes, it wasn't always easy. Growing hemp is hard work. It takes a lot of labor. And after you harvest it, you have to ret it, which means letting it rot a little in water or on the ground to separate the fibers from the stalk. It's smelly and takes time, so while everyone understood its importance, it wasn't always the most popular crop to grow for individual farmers when they had other choices. Still, for many years, hemp was just a part of colonial life. George Washington grew it. Thomas Jefferson grew it. They weren't growing it to get high, which is a common misunderstanding today. They were growing it for its strong fibers. Washington's diaries mention it quite a bit. He saw it as a good cash crop and something the country needed. He even experimented with different ways to process it. So, in these early days, there was definitely a strong emphasis on growing hemp. Laws were passed to encourage it, sometimes even to mandate a certain amount, but it was usually in the context of specific needs, like paying taxes or fulfilling a quota for the crown. It wasn't a blanket universal law saying every single farm and every single colony had to dedicate times amount of land to hemp. It was more targeted, more about filling a very real, very important need. And for a young, growing nation, that need was constant. Without hemp, there were no ropes, no sails, no efficient way to move goods or defend yourself. It was truly a foundational crop for a long time. After America won its independence, the need for hemp didn't go away. If anything, it became even more important to be self-sufficient. The country didn't want to rely on other nations for critical materials. They wanted to build their own industries, their own navy, and their own economy. And for all those things, hemp was still king when it came to strong, durable fibers. The new United States government, just like the colonial governments before it, understood this. They continue to encourage hemp cultivation, but again, the word encourage is key here. It wasn't always a harsh, you must do this or else command that applied to every farmer in every field. It was more about creating conditions where growing hemp made good economic sense for farmers. Think about the early 1800s. The country was expanding, more land was opening up. People were moving westward, and with that expansion came more demand for everything. The ships were still being built. Wagons needed tarpaulins. Clothing was still made from natural fibers. And while cotton was starting to become a big deal, especially in the South, hemp still held its own for specific uses where strength was paramount. Some states really got into promoting hemp. Kentucky, for example, became a major hemp-producing state. The rich soil and climate were perfect for it. Lawmakers there understood the economic potential. They might offer things like prizes for the best hemp, or they'd pass laws that made it easier for hemp farmers to get their product to market. This wasn't a direct mandate to plant, but it was a strong nudge. It said, we value this crop and we'll help you if you grow it. The federal government also played a role. They might place tariffs on imported hemp, making foreign hemp more expensive and domestic hemp more competitive. That's a classic way governments try to boost local industries. It doesn't force anyone to grow hemp, but it makes it more profitable if they do. Farmers, like anyone else, are going to grow what makes them money. If the government makes hemp more profitable, more farmers will choose to grow it. But let's be clear about the nature of these laws. They weren't usually about forcing every single person with a patch of land to plant hemp. Instead, they were about creating an environment where hemp cultivation was desirable and economically viable. For instance, in some areas, farmers might have been required to pay a certain amount of their taxes in hemp, or contribute a certain amount to local production for military needs. These were often localized and specific, not a broad federal mandate across all agricultural land. The challenges of growing hemp still existed, though. It was still labor intensive. And processing, it was still a dirty, hard job. As new technologies came along, like the cotton gin, other crops became easier and more profitable to process. This meant that while hemp was always important, it faced increasing competition. The distinction between industrial hemp and other varieties of cannabis was not really a thing in the same way it is today. They were all just hemp. People understood that some plants made you feel funny if you consumed them, but the vast majority of hemp grown in America was for fiber. That's what the government was interested in. That's what the economy needed. The focus was on the practical industrial uses of the plant. So, in these decades after the American Revolution, the push for homegrown hemp continued. It was a strategic economic and military decision. Laws and policies were designed to encourage production, to make it a smart choice for farmers. It wasn't about dictating what every farmer had to do, but about guiding the agricultural economy toward a crop that served the national interest. They wanted to make it an attractive option, and in many places, especially in states like Kentucky and Missouri, they succeeded in building robust hemp industries. But always remember, it was a balance of national need, economic incentive, and the practical realities of farming. Nobody was really being dragged out to their fields and forced at gunpoint to plant hemp, but the economic and political pressure could be very strong. Hemp's long reign as a crucial crop eventually started to fade. This didn't happen overnight, but it was a slow process driven by several big changes. One major factor was the rise of cotton. With the invention of the cotton gin in the late 1700s, processing cotton became much, much easier and cheaper. Cotton could be grown in huge quantities, especially in the American South, and it quickly became the dominant fiber for clothing. Hemp was still needed for ropes and canvas, but for everyday textiles, cotton took over. Then came other innovations. Steamships started to replace sailing ships, reducing the demand for sailcloth. New synthetic fibers, like nylon, started to appear in the early 20th century. Nylon was super strong and didn't rot, making it a great alternative for ropes and other industrial uses. Their technology was basically finding new ways to do what hemp used to do, often more cheaply or efficiently. So, by the early 1900s, hemp farming was already in decline. It just wasn't as profitable or as necessary as it once was. Farmers had other, easier, more lucrative options. The laborious process of growing and processing hemp couldn't really compete. But then something else happened that really sealed hemp's fate, the marijuana scare. In the early 20th century, there was a growing fear and prejudice against cannabis, often fueled by racist sentiments and sensationalized media reports. The word marijuana itself became popular around this time, partly because it sounded foreign and scary. The problem was, marijuana and hemp are both names for the cannabis sativa plant. The only real difference is the amount of THC, the compound that makes you feel high. Industrial hemp has very little THC, usually less than 0.3%. Marijuana has a lot more. But at the time, this distinction wasn't widely understood or even acknowledged by lawmakers and the public. To them, it was all just cannabis or marijuana. This public fear and misunderstanding led to the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. This was a federal law that didn't technically make cannabis illegal, but it made it so heavily taxed and regulated that it was practically impossible to grow it legally. If you wanted to grow, import, or sell cannabis, you needed special stamps and licenses, and you had to pay huge taxes on every transaction. It was designed to discourage all cannabis production, whether it was for industrial fiber or for getting high. The intent was to control what was perceived as a dangerous drug, but because industrial hemp was biologically the same plant, it got caught in the crossfire. Even though hemp farmers and businesses argued that their crop had no psychoactive properties and was still important for industry, their pleas were largely ignored. The government's focus was on stopping the recreational use of marijuana. The Marijuana Tax Act effectively killed the American hemp industry. It became too expensive and too complicated to grow it. Farmers couldn't afford the taxes or the paperwork, and they certainly couldn't find a market for a crop that was now treated like a dangerous drug. So, what few hemp farms were left just disappeared. It's a sad chapter in American agriculture. A plant that was once vital, encouraged by founding fathers, and essential for the country's development, was suddenly lumped in with dangerous narcotics. This wasn't because of any change in the plant itself or its industrial uses, but because of a moral panic and a lack of scientific distinction between varieties of the same plant. So, by the late 1930s, hemp went from being a historical staple to an outlawed plant. No one was encouraging farmers to grow it anymore. Quite the opposite. The law, even if it wasn't a direct ban, created so many hurdles that growing hemp became a thing of the past for most American farmers. The stage was set for decades of prohibition, only to be briefly interrupted by an unexpected turn of events. Just a few years after the Marijuana Tax Act effectively wiped out American hemp farming, something huge happened that completely flipped the script World War II. And suddenly, the US government needed hemp again, desperately. When the war started, especially after the attack on Pearl Harbor, America's supply lines for critical materials were cut off. A lot of the world's best hemp came from places like the Philippines and other parts of Asia. But with Japan controlling those regions, that supply was gone, and modern warfare required a ton of hemp ropes for ships, parachutes, strong canvas for tents and tarps, fire hoses, uniform stitching, shoelaces, the list went on and on. There was no good substitute for many of these uses at the time. The US government realized it had a massive problem. They had destroyed their own domestic hemp industry just a few years earlier, and now they needed it back, fast. So they launched a massive urgent campaign called Hemp for Victory. This was a full-blown propaganda effort. The government produced a film, also called Hemp for Victory, which explained to farmers why they needed to grow hemp for the war effort and how to do it. It called on patriotic farmers to plant the crop. They were saying, this isn't just farming, this is your duty to your country. But here's the crucial part. Was it a requirement? Not in the sense of a universal mandatory law telling every farmer in America they must plant hemp or face penalties. Instead, it was an incredibly strong, well-funded government program with huge incentives. The government didn't just ask farmers to grow hemp, they contracted with them. They built new hemp processing mills, sometimes right next to the fields. First, they supplied farmers with seeds. They guaranteed a market and a good price for the crop. Essentially, the government was saying, we need this. If you grow it, we will give you the seeds, tell you how to do it, process it for you, and pay you well. You are helping win the war. This was an offer that was hard to refuse for many farmers, especially as other crops might have fluctuating prices or uncertain markets. Growing hemp for the government was stable and patriotic. Thousands of farmers signed up. In just a few years, millions of acres of hemp were planted across states like Kentucky, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois. It was a remarkable turnaround. The industry that had been choked out by the Marijuana Tax Act was resurrected almost overnight, driven by the desperate needs of wartime. The government even temporarily suspended some of the regulations from the Marijuana Tax Act for farmers growing hemp under these specific wartime contracts. They basically acknowledged, look, this is industrial fiber, it's not the drug we're worried about, we need this for the war. It was a moment of pragmatism overriding earlier moral panic. So, while not every farmer in America was legally mandated to grow hemp, the Hemp for Victory program was about as close as you could get to a requirement without actually being one. It was a national emergency. Farmers were strongly encouraged, incentivized, and supported to grow this vital crop. It was a call to arms for agriculture, and farmers responded with immense patriotism. But this surge in hemp production was temporary. It lasted only as long as the war did. As soon as the war ended and international supply lines reopened, the need for domestic hemp disappeared. The contracts ended, the mills closed down, and the regulatory hammer of the Marijuana Tax Act and later drug laws came back down, once again effectively outlawing the cultivation of hemp. It was a brief, intense, but ultimately short-lived moment in the sun for American hemp farming. As quickly as the Hemp for Victory program got American farmers growing hemp, it shut down just as fast after World War II. The government contracts disappeared, the emergency was over, foreign supplies were available again. And the underlying legal framework of the Marijuana Tax Act was still in place, making it incredibly difficult and expensive to grow hemp. So after 1945, hemp cultivation in the United States once again basically ceased. It went back to being an outlawed crop, often confused with its psychoactive cousin, marijuana. Any lingering efforts to distinguish industrial hemp from drug cannabis were largely ignored by lawmakers. Then came the 1970s and the Controlled Substances Act, CSA. This was a landmark piece of federal legislation that created a scheduling system for drugs. Cannabis, regardless of its THC content, was placed in Schedule Y. This is the strictest category, reserved for drugs with a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. This law didn't make any distinction between a plant grown for fiber and a plant grown for recreational use. All cannabis was treated the same. This solidified hemp's prohibition for decades. Growing any form of the plant was a federal crime. For nearly 50 years, that was the situation. It was illegal to grow hemp in the U.S. period. The idea of a law requiring farmers to grow it became absurd. The question shifted from did they have to could they even? And the answer was a resounding no. But things started to change in the 21st century. There was a growing awareness and education about the difference between industrial hemp low THC and marijuana high THC. Farmers, researchers, and entrepreneurs began to push for hemp to be recognized as a distinct agricultural commodity, separate from its drug-producing relative. This movement gained traction, leading to the 2014 Farm Bill. This bill included a provision that allowed states to set up pilot programs for growing industrial hemp for research purposes, as long as the plants contained less than 0.3% THC. This was a small but significant step. It was the first time in decades that any legal hemp cultivation was possible in the U.S. The real game changer, though, was the 2018 Farm Bill. This bill federally legalized industrial hemp cultivation across the United States. It removed hemp defined as cannabis with less than 0.3% THC from the Controlled Substances Act. This meant that hemp was no longer considered a Schedule I drug. It was recognized as an agricultural crop, just like corn or soybeans. States still had to submit plans to the USDA for regulating hemp production, but the federal prohibition was over. So, what's the answer to the big question? Did a law once require farmers to grow hemp? The short answer is not in the sense of a universal permanent blanket mandate for all farmers. But here's the nuanced truth one. Early colonial and post-independence era. During colonial times and the early years of the U.S., some laws strongly encouraged hemp cultivation. Some even required a certain amount of hemp to be grown for specific purposes, like paying taxes or contributing to military supplies. These were often localized and driven by critical needs. It was about making it a priority and a good economic choice, rather than forcing everyone at gunpoint. The government launched a massive patriotic campaign, provided seeds, built processing plants, and guaranteed purchase at good prices. While farmers weren't technically mandated by law to grow it, the pressure, incentives, and national urgency were so immense that many did. It was a temporary, wartime measure, not a permanent legal requirement. The idea of a law that broadly, universally, and perpetually required all farmers to grow hemp throughout American history is a myth. The reality is more complex. Hemp was essential, then it faded, then it was effectively outlawed, briefly revived by war, and then outlawed again, only to be finally re-legalized for industrial purposes just a few years ago. Today, no law requires farmers to grow hemp. Instead, laws now allow and regulate it. Farmers can choose to grow it, and many are exploring its potential for CBD, fiber, grain, and other products. It's a crop making a comeback, but this time it's by choice and economic opportunity, not by government mandate or wartime necessity. The story of hemp is a constant reminder that the needs of a nation and the legal landscape for a crop can change dramatically over time.